Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker, Casey, and it's not long now before CrimeCon in London on June the 11th and 12th in partnership with CBS Reality. Come and join us for a weekend packed full of true crime experiences, including panels with private investigators, talks with victims' families, workshops with police dogs, and crime scene investigation skill building. Come and watch my first ever live interview with cult survivor and activist Elgin Strait, host of Falling Out Pod, whose work has been the catalyst for many people to leave the Unification Church and deconstruct their experiences. Visit crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT for 10% off ticket prices today. This episode is a two-parter, with part one including a deep dive into a South Korean Christian religious sect called the World Mission Society Church of God, with former Deaconess Tony, who speaks about her experiences within this movement. And part two comes next week, where I will be interviewing Tony's sister Lindsay about what she remembers of her sister's conversion and rapid integration into this very insular, high-demand religious group. So hello, Tony, and welcome to the show. We are going to be discussing a topic today which has been previously discussed on the show, but from a very different perspective and in a lot more detail. We may not be using real names of the movement, but we might mention it. We'll see how things go. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Hi, Casey. My name is Tony. What a complicated question, introducing myself. My name is Tony. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. And I was raised in a Christian family. So, from the time I was little, I just remember, believing in God. And I have a lot of family in the South, in South Carolina. I don't know if you're familiar, but in the South, it's very religious and very conservative. And so I also have like a lot of those strong backgrounds. And then after high school, when I was in college, I joined a church. I joined a church in April 2006 when I was 22 years old. And I just went all in with this group. And I just totally, believed and devoted myself. And I spent a lot of time there. When I was there, I got married there. I became a mother when I was there. I became a deaconess when I was there. I became a house church leader. And then a lot of things happened. And then I finally, I got out in 2020, April 2020. And now I'm just sort of on this whole new path of understanding what happened during those years and sort of discovering, who I am and, where my life can go. So I'm 38 now. So I don't know, is that
that's a great answer. I think it kind of gives us a little summary of everything that we're going to be discussing today, sort of the beginning, middle, and end of your journey with this particular experience. And you actually have your own podcast where you discuss these experiences at length with your co-host. That is also your sister, Lindsay. Is that right?
That's right. So we actually started our own podcast called Playing in Traffic. We started it last year. So this was all part of my healing, because when I came out of this group, I was in shock. And I want to talk to you about like all the different symptoms that I would have and like trauma symptoms that I was experiencing. And I couldn't really understand what had happened to me. But my sister was really like my sounding board through it all. Like she was with me through the whole experience. And so we would have these conversations where I was just starting to, when I came out, I felt like I had wasted all those years. And so now coming out, I want to use that experience to help people. So anyway, so we started this podcast, and it's been really, really fun and exciting and healing, because if anybody listens, it's interesting because in the first episode, I couldn't even use the word cult. Like, I don't know if that's similar with other survivors, but like that word is so it was so hard for me to say, to even think about. I didn't I didn't want to believe that I was in a cult. I didn't believe it, you know. So anyway, it's sort of like the transformation of me figuring out what had happened and just sort of that process. And now I'm in a totally different place. And, you know, it's only been, you know, not even a full year of speaking, and it's just been so helpful. So yeah.
And I've listened to the podcast, and it's so refreshing to just hear the back and forth and the rapport and the connection that you and your sister have when you're talking about such a heavy subject. It's kind of like a nice juxtaposition between the two things. So Playing in Traffic is available on all podcast networks, wherever you get your podcasts. So definitely go and check that out. I'm sure that we will talk about the podcast as we go on. But if anybody wants to hear more in-depth and discussions around this particular movement that we don't manage to get through today because they're only one episode in length, and even though they may be a few hours long, it still really doesn't scratch the surface of the stuff that's explored on your platform. So if anybody does want to go and find out more, then I do recommend going to listen to Playing in Traffic. And when I listened to your podcast for the first time, I was drinking a hot drink, and all of a sudden this Disclosure song started playing, and I almost just like spat coffee across my kitchen. I just wasn't expecting it. And I wondered if it would be okay if we were to just insert that Disclosure song into this episode at this point, so the listeners can hear what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Welcome to Playing in Traffic. This is our disclaimer song. This is our disclaimer song. It's our opinion. Don't sue us. Don't sue us. If you didn't want us to make a podcast about you, then you probably shouldn't have started a religion where you brainwash people and separated them from your family, so it's kind of your fault. But don't sue us. Don't sue us. You know who you are, so don't do it. Don't sue us. Don't sue us.
That's so funny.
That's my sister. So that's Lindsay and her ukulele.
I just thought that was so fun. It was so unexpected. So I hope everybody enjoys listening to it at this point. And before we get into talking about your experiences in this group, you joined it a little bit later on in life, which is not always typical of high demand religious groups when we talk about them in the show. A lot of the time we speak to second, third, often even fourth or fifth generation members of high demand religious groups. But as you mentioned there in your introduction, you joined a little bit later on in life at the age of 22.
Right.
So what was your life like before you came across this movement? You mentioned that you grew up in a Christian family. Does this mean that you would go and participate in traditional Christian activities, like going to church on Sundays, very, very much celebrating seasonal holidays, Christmases, and things like that?
So we would go to church semi-regularly when we were little. We were not by any means a very Christian family, but I would say my grandparents really instilled a strong belief in God and the Christian God of the Bible. So for me, that was just always my reality as a little girl. And so as I grew up and coming out of high school and being in college, I really was like, always just remember searching for God, searching for the truth, you know, feeling like God was always had my back and was with me and stuff like that. So that's kind of where I was when I joined the group. Like that was kind of my mindset.
So you'd grown up with Christian belief system in place, but pretty liberal in terms of your church commitments and observing traditional Christian activities and holidays.
Right. So we would go to church on Christmas and on Easter and things like that, mostly.
So where were you in your life at 22, were you searching or seeking for something different? What actually happened in terms of you having your first interactions with this movement?
Okay, so I was in college and I was searching. I remember I had read the whole New Testament and I was looking for a church because I just, I was an adult now and I was engaged to my fiance and I wanted somewhere to go and somewhere for us to raise our kids and, just somewhere where we could have a strong religious like home base. And I was in college and I just love learning. I love learning and I love reading. And I was in this class, it was the history of Christianity. And I had to write a paper about salvation. And one of my old high school friends had kept bugging me about going to a Bible study. And I knew that he was in town. So I was like, okay, you can come to my house and do a Bible study and help me write this paper about salvation. And let me tell you, he was at my house within 15 minutes, ready to do this Bible study, and he stayed there for hours and hours. And he just, bombarded me with these intense things that I had never heard of, I had never imagined before. And I was really excited and he was really excited. And yeah. And so after that, pretty quick after that, I actually got my fiance to come with me to study the Bible. And so we went to the church, and we studied the Bible there. And pretty soon after that, we were baptized.
Let me just go back on a few things and kind of have a little look. So your fiance at this point, was he like your childhood sweetheart, would you say?
No. So we had been dating maybe a few years at that point.
And he grew up with a kind of Christian background himself?
Sort of similar Christian background, but not very strict, and he did not really want to go to church. He didn't really want to have anything to do with religion, but he supported me. And so when he saw how excited I was, and he also knew this friend, this was also, one of his friends too. So, we just felt like, let's just go check it out. He really caught our attention. He's really excited about something and, we should just go hear him out and see what it's about.
And this person you mentioned was a high school friend.
Yes. And this high school friend had a mom who is a minister. So we really trusted him. It was somebody that we had a lot of spiritual conversations with in the past, over years of time. So it was somebody that we had already like trusted spiritually, somebody that we believed already knew the Bible, so we could trust him. And I still would to this day. I would still trust that person. It's just in a different way.
So when he is asking you to consider Bible study or Bible classes with him, at this point, you're not thinking that it is with another group or another belief system or anything like that. You're associating it with what you know about him, which is that his family's involved in the church. And so you're already just kind of tying his relationship to his faith with your lived experience.
Exactly. And so it's interesting looking back now. I would always sort of repeat this to myself, like how blessed I was. Okay, when I was in the church, this is what I would think. I'm so blessed that God allowed me to know him and create that relationship with him, that he led me to the truth. And so I thought that over and over and over for more than 10 years, how blessed I was that we had this connection, that, that he would lead me to the truth. But then once I stopped that pattern and I looked back, I thought, wow, maybe I was just vulnerable to him. Like you said, just knowing his background, trusting him really blindly. When he said, come to this Bible study, it was presented as a non-denomination Christian Bible study. And, that sounds like all the other regular Bible studies. So there was nothing about it that threw me off at all. Like I was just so vulnerable and so trusting at that point to just go with him and hear what they had to say.
Do you feel as if the student demographic is an age group that is targeted quite aggressively by this particular movement?
I do. I absolutely do. It's something that I would like to be more vocal about. the more that I'm learning about mind control tactics is that people are vulnerable when they're in that transition state of their life. And when you're transitioning from high school to college to starting your new life and having children, I mean, that's a very vulnerable age to be in. And that is so this group sets up Bible study classes at campuses. They like to preach to young people who have a lot of energy and have a lot to offer to the group. They use Bible verses to justify that, or to show, that prophecy would be fulfilled in the last days by the youth, like the dew of the dawn. And so God's army in the last days will be youthful and young. And so they use that to justify when they go preaching to college campuses and to young groups like that. But looking back now, I wonder how ethical that may be, because this is a vulnerable population, and I would like to have more education on that, because I was not educated about cults, or I didn't even imagine that a Christian church could be a cult. Like, I just didn't know, and it was a different time. It was 2006 is when I got baptized. So, we didn't have smartphones in our pockets like we do now. We didn't Google everything. Social media wasn't so big. And so it was easier for me to not have a lot of information at my hands.
You met with the friend, the initial Bible study went really well. You felt encouraged and enthused, and so you quickly went with him to a class or taught by the actual movement itself that you became an official part of. And was that off campus or on campus?
So he was my friend from high school. And so he came to my house to study. And so then from there, we actually just went to the church. The church was like 5 minutes from my childhood home. So I thought, oh my God, I'm so blessed that God's true church is just 5 minutes from my childhood home. And looking back, I'm like, oh my God, how naive that was. But that was how I thought. That was what I thought. And so you go into the church and everybody is so nice, so welcoming and so nice. And this was in Denver in 2006. And so the church was very small then. I mean, there were maybe like 3 or 4 people when we went to the church that day, and they put you into a little study room, and they have a big board, and then there's somebody standing up like a teacher, and then you're sitting like a student, and it's very personalized. And they're dressed in like a suit, and it's very professional. And so it just really feels very authentic. And so there's nothing about it that would ever make you feel like it wasn't real. Do you know what I mean? So anyway, so then they just started, teaching us about the Sabbath day and about how Saturday was the real day to worship God and not Sunday. And honestly, I was so mind blown by that. I was so shocked that we had been worshiping God on Sunday and that we were supposed to be doing it on Saturday. And that's what got me right there. That is what got me right there. And the Passover, they taught about how when Jesus kept the communion, the picture we see of the Last Supper where he's eating the bread and the wine, they believe that is actually, what he was celebrating at that time was called the Passover. And it's also in the Old Testament. And so they believe that when Jesus said, eat my flesh and drink my blood, that promise is only given on the Passover only. So like communion or anything else, that doesn't count. It has to be the Passover. And so when Jesus kept the Passover with his disciples, but then after Jesus went to heaven, Satan came and mixed everything up and got rid of the Passover. And they use all this historical evidence about the Council of Nicaea and how Passover was destroyed. That's why Christ had to come in the last days to reestablish the Passover. So they believe that second coming Christ came again as a human being and reestablish the Passover. And so all of these things just, got me right away. And so we were baptized. I would say we were baptized, within the first first few days of studying.
Wow.
Me and my husband were both baptized together, and it was such a small church. We were baptized in a bathroom. We were baptized in a bathtub. So it was very interesting.
That is very interesting and very different from a lot of the other experiences that we've heard about for the most part on this podcast, in the sense that usually there's a very meticulous and vigorous process that a person has to go through, either from birth into childhood into early teens, where they will have to go through a specific set of questions or standards or procedures to be able to move forward with a baptism, or to fulfill a certain level of evangelizing or pioneering before they are offered the opportunity for baptism. Or sometimes it will be financial contributions or time spent within the church, or like with Shinchunji that we've spoken about at length. There's a very slow funneling into the group before the name of the group is even revealed to the individual who is taking part in similar Bible studies in the way that we've just spoken about. So it's very surprising to hear that you rocked up and a couple of days later you were in the bathtub.
Yes. So actually, this group is different in that way. They believe that you should be baptized immediately, and that's the beginning of your salvation. So as soon as you're baptized, they see you as a spiritual baby. And so from that moment on, from that moment, that's when it begins. You need to start your Bible studies. You need to start keeping God's commandments. Then you need to start evangelizing. And then, so from that moment, it takes on. But they want you to get baptized immediately. There will be people that study for an hour and get baptized.
Wow.
So it's like, so they use the Bible to show that baptism should be done immediately. So as soon as you believe, then you should get baptized. And then, like I said, so from there, then that's when it starts.
So if some high demand groups have lengthy processes and commitments and expectations that people have to go through in order to get baptized, that in itself, that striving for something, that trying to meet an objective or goal, may be a way that somebody can manipulate or control another person's thoughts or actions in terms of their commitment to the church and their faith. What do you think the purpose is of having a baptism in such a short amount of time?
Ooh, like from a tactical point of view, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I've never really thought about it, but maybe I think it's just to get them right away. I think it's just to make them part of the family right away. The reason why they do it is when you get baptized, you're allowed to keep the Passover. And like I was talking about, the Passover is like their main doctrine. And really by keeping the Passover is only once a year, but you're also allowed to do it when you get baptized only. So as soon as you get baptized, you celebrate the Passover right away with the bread and the wine. And so that's a way to protected. So they really force it on you as far as like a fear tactic. So like you need to be protected right now, because you don't, especially right now what's happening in the world, I'm sure they're using it a lot. You don't know what's going to happen. Disasters are happening, war is coming, so you need God's protection today.
Right.
You cannot wait until tomorrow. So it's like, it's a way to hook, I think, using fear. And then from that moment on, you're like, okay, well, now I need to learn. They actually don't really want you to learn until you're baptized. They want you to be baptized, and then you can learn everything that you need to learn. That's for later.
Do you think that there's perhaps that initial sunk cost fallacy already in play by that point? If you get baptized so quickly and then you decide a week later that maybe that group's not for you, do you think there are people already thinking, but I've been through this event, I've been through this process, I have been given the opportunity to experience Passover. It would be negative now for me to leave the group after having this initial experience.
Absolutely. And when you get baptized, okay, so they're called fruit, and then you have a messenger. So so they have a book of life. And so when you get baptized, you write your name and then you write who brought you. So you'll have your two messengers. And so those messengers are in charge of you. And so they are in charge of making sure that you are doing your correct studies. They're in charge of bringing you to church. They're in charge of giving you a ride or helping whatever situation so that you can come to keep God's commandments is how they're viewing it. So from the minute you're baptized, you're always going to have somebody contacting you. Somebody's going to be contacting you to come for the Bible study. So it's not really like you're just baptized and then you're just part of the congregation. You're baptized and then you're put into a group. There's a whole church organization with unit leaders, group leaders, team leaders. And so each member is under a Bible teacher. And so that Bible teacher knows everything about that group member, and they know where they live. They have their phone number. And so if you don't show up for church, they'll come to your house and visit you. I did that. I would go and visit people. Why aren't you coming to church? You need to come keep the Sabbath day. You need to be blessed by God, so they will come and find you. And so when you have that kind of pressure, it's really hard not to go back. And everybody's so nice to you. They're like, come have dinner with us and do a Bible study. Bring your kids. They can play. They take care of everything so that you can come and just focus on the Bible study. You don't have to worry about your kids. You don't have to worry about cooking dinner. You don't have to worry about anything. All you have to do is just come, bring your Bible, and do the Bible study. Your face right now.
I'm just thinking about how the baptism, it feels now with your explanation that the baptism is almost like a disclaimer, like by signing on the dotted line or by going through this process, you are giving us permission, or you are signing yourself up to constant badgering and hounding and expectations that you will attend every single commitment that we think you should be attending.
But the thing is like when you get baptized, you don't know that's what you're signing on for. You just think that you're joining a Christian group and that you're going to, be protected by God. That's all you think, but you don't realize, like you said, that they're going to be texting you. They're going to be calling you. They're going to be showing up to your house. They're going to be showing up to your job, all kinds of things to try to get you to come back.
Is it ever used against you in that sense? Like we've allowed you to have this baptism. We've allowed you to experience Passover. So now you kind of owe us for gifting you with these things?
Maybe not put in a way like you owe us, but more you owe God.
Right.
Like God bless you to keep the Passover. So now you need to keep the Sabbath day and show your favor to God. You need to worship God and give thanks to God for blessing you with salvation. More like that.
You go to a few sessions, you're baptized very quickly, and then you realize very soon after that event that this interest that you have and this new group that you've joined may require more from you than you initially anticipated in terms of going to different services and Bible studies. And you said that you were really surprised by the views and the passages in the Old Testament that had been interpreted differently from what you were used to. So the group is coming at you with some pretty messianic, perhaps, theologies and things that you had not heard too much about growing up in your Christian home where you celebrated things like Christmas. So if there is more of a messianic approach with this particular group, are things like Christmas not celebrated?
Right, correct. So they believe that we need to keep God's commandments, and things like Christmas and Easter and all the things, Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day, these are all pagan. They all have pagan origins, and they all come from worshiping other gods. And so we don't want to, as God's people, we should not be doing those things. And by doing those things, you have the mark of the beast. So they explain God's people have the seal of God, which is by keeping the Passover, you have God's protection. But, there's the people that have the mark of the beast, and you receive that by celebrating these pagan festivals and man-made traditions. And so it's a very clear black and white, us versus them. God's people. And then and so that created a big problem in my personal family, because like you said, we grew up celebrating Christmas. My grandma loves Christmas. Like, yeah, I can't even explain how much my family loves Christmas. So when I came, I'm in my early 20s and I say, I'm not celebrating Christmas anymore. It's pagan, it caused a big rift within my family, my husband's family, and friends. I mean, yeah, it just totally creates a division within families. And that's where the problem is how these groups divide families. And this is how it's done.
Especially because you mentioned at the start that the Christian identity that you may have had growing up, or part of your identity being related to Christianity in the liberal sense, came from your grandparents. So for you to then have the teachings or beliefs that everything that your grandparents have been practicing their entire lives with their faith system is wrong because they would go to church on Sundays, and they would take part in communion on Sundays, and then you're kind of then realizing that if you follow this new belief system that you've been introduced to, they are wrong and they can't be saved, and they haven't been baptized in the way that you have. So there's conflict in that sense of differing belief systems as well, I suppose.
Exactly. You said it so perfectly. I've never fought with my grandma until Easter. That first, because I was baptized in 2006, and that was right when Easter was happening. And so the church was giving me a lot of pressure. Don't celebrate Easter. You were just saved. You don't want to go and get the mark of the beast. And my grandma, you can't celebrate Easter. We need to get the Passover. And she didn't want to listen. So that was one of the only times I've ever fought with my grandma, and it just continued to be a struggle throughout all of the years. And it just really caused a division in the family. So that was really hard.
And in terms of foregoing celebrating things like Christmas and Easter, how did this particular movement view things like birthdays and individualism in that sense?
They all need to sort of be a group together. And so individualism isn't really allowed. Everybody sort of dresses the same, talks the same, eats the same. I mean, everything is done as a group. And so things like birthdays, it's not like they would ever say, don't celebrate your birthday, but it's like, what's the point in celebrating my birthday? I'm just a wicked sinner. It's meaningless. It's pointless, but that was hard for me because I had young children. And I do want to celebrate their birthdays, and so I would make sure to, do special things with them. And that was one thing my family would always say, like, how can you not let your children celebrate Christmas? That was a very, very big struggle. And my oldest, he is 15 now, and he just celebrated his first Christmas. So it's very, it's interesting. We have an interesting family. So we got him a shirt and it says baby's first Christmas, and it's an extra large because he's 15 and it's very cute.
I love that. Yeah, I want to see family pictures of that Christmas. That sounds incredible. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the core principles and practices that may set this particular religious movement apart from others that we've spoken about on the show before, is there anything notable other than kind of observing Sabbath that might make this group different in their interpretations of the Bible or the belief systems that they have? Is there anything that makes them particularly unique in their own practices?
Right. So there are many differences. I think it's important to explain sort of the overall spiritual view that they have, because it's important to understand, because when people hear their teachings, they're like, that's crazy. I would never believe that. But But when you just hear it like that, like bullet pointed, of course, okay. But when you understand like their whole spiritual viewpoint, then you understand how easily you can get trapped. So they believe in, and all of this is biblical. This is all a Bible-based group. Okay. All of this can be justified by the Bible, which I think is just important to understand, But they believe that we are sinners from heaven. They believe that we committed sin in heaven against God. And so, as a punishment, we were sent to the earth. And so, the earth is our punishment. So, they view the earth as a prison. And so, this is where all the prisoners live. Every single person that's ever lived on the earth is a sinner and a prisoner. And so, we live on the earth with Satan. So, everything on the earth is bad. Everything on the earth is bad and to deceive us and to tempt us. And so our whole life has to be about being redeemed and repenting and like finding our way back to heaven. But the only way that we can do that is God had to come to the earth. So Jesus came to the earth in the flesh to teach us all of the ways to go to heaven. But then after he was crucified, Satan came into the church and jumbled up all the ways to go to heaven. So that's why Sabbath was changed into Sunday, Passover was changed into communion. So all of God's people got confused. And so that was the time of the dark ages. And so, all God's people were lost until 1918, when Christ would come again from the east. Christ would be coming from the east to save us and to reteach us all of the truth. And so they believe that second coming Christ was born in 1918. An Sang-hong was born as the second coming Christ from South Korea. And in 1948, he was baptized. And so he started his ministry as the second coming Christ. And so he brought back the teachings of the Sabbath and the Passover. And so he started the Church of God at that time. And then he revealed the biggest mystery in the Bible, which is about children. Then why shouldn't we have a mother? And all of that made so much sense to me as a woman and as a mother, and that was definitely something that I could believe in. But I would definitely say that is something that sticks out in this church. So then he actually, quote unquote, ascended to heaven in 1985. He died and he went back to heaven. And so then when he died, he left the church to God the Mother, who is also in the flesh in a human form right now living on the earth in South Korea. And so right now she's the leader of this church.
And does she have any significant relationship to the person that led this movement prior to his death?
Not that I know of. So it's, from what I understand, she was a missionary in the church when he was alive. And this wasn't something that he taught. When you sent over questions, you asked me for the history of the church, and I was really thinking about it. And I was thinking, there's two histories. There's the history that I was taught when you're in the church, the history that you're taught as a church member. But then coming out, there's also the history that I learned, the real history. So the history that I was taught is kind of the one that I told you. An Sang-hong was born in 1918. He was baptized when he was 30, just like Jesus was. And then he did his ministry for 37 years as a spiritual King David. It's all these prophecies that he was a spiritual King David. And so after 37 years, he had to fulfill the ministry. And so then he went to heaven and he revealed God the Mother. And now God the Mother is leading the world, leading the mission. Okay, so that's their history. But then when I came out of the church, this was the history that I learned, was that, yes, An Sang-hong was born in 1918, and he was a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church when he was young. And his baptism date is disputed, and nobody can really say for sure when he was baptized, which is really important because the baptism date is used by the church as a prophecy. And so if his baptism date isn't really 1948, then it's sort of like all of the other prophecies sort of crumble apart, which is why I'm trying to make that point. But anyway, so they're not really sure exactly when he was baptized. And so then he established the Witnesses of Jesus Church of God in 1964. And then after he died, the church was divided into two different churches, and he had children. And so his children went to one church, and then God the Mother went to another church and established the World Mission Society Church of God. And then from there, that's when the church started spreading all over the world. And so the church right now is led by Zong Gilja and Ju Chol Kim, and they call him the general pastor. And so the two of them lead the church right now in Korea. But the church is spread all over the world. Like I said, I'm in Denver, Colorado, and we have, they have churches all over the world.
And it's interesting, when we covered this subject before, and I spoke with Haley, who talked about sort of a dual experience between this movement and Shincheonji in the same episode. And she was a college student as well. I don't know if you thought that was an interesting parallel between your two experiences.
Absolutely.
And a few things that you've said there that I think are important to just mention before we move on is that when I spoke to Caroline about her experiences in the Latter-day Saints, I thought it was so interesting that the version of Joseph Smith and the history of the Mormon Church that she had grown up being taught and believing in was absolutely nothing like the version that she learned only after she decided to leave in her adulthood. So she'd grown up not knowing that there was even another interpretation or another version or any kind of differing details to the ones that she'd been taught her entire life. So that was really sort of an experience for her to leave the Latter-day Saints and then realize that there was this whole other side of the story around Joseph Smith and his perhaps a con man and moving around and so I just thought that was a really interesting parallel to draw.
I actually visited Korea, so they have trips where you go and you visit, and I went 2 times, and they do a great job of creating propaganda to make you see the history in their way, the church history, the history of Ansanghong, the history of how the church was established. And they do such a great job that you don't even think to question it. And also, like I mentioned at that time, the internet wasn't quite so readily available like it is now. And they really scare you away from looking at the internet to find the real history. And I'm sure it's the same, with Joseph Smith. They scare you that if you look on the internet that you're going to be tempted and that you're going to be led astray. So you don't want to do that. And so that control of information is just so crucial in these tactics. Without controlling the information, they wouldn't be able to get away with this.
Especially when you consider that the main religions in South Korea are Buddhism and Christianity. So if there is a really good job of generating and positioning this propaganda on those visits to Korea, if you weren't aware of that fact around the main practicing religions, or that there is no particular denomination of Christianity that stands out more than the rest, and you see all this propaganda on your arrival, there's going to be no question in your mind that most people in Korea that are practicing a religion are probably practicing the same one as you visit.
Right.
And the reason I asked the question about the current leadership of this particular movement is because another famous leader or infamous leader of another movement that came from South Korea, when he died, and I'm kind of referencing Sun Myung Moon here, when he died, he left the church and its entire legacy to his wife, Mrs. Moon, who now runs the church, even though several different family members, including two of their sons, have branched off to create their own factions of the Unification Church that are even more extreme in their beliefs and practices, which is a whole other episode. But if anybody isn't aware of the factions that exist outside of the Unification Church, just go and have a Google, because it's, I mean, if you're interested in getting down a rabbit hole today, then that's definitely one
fascinating
one way you could go. And then Lee Man-hee, who is the leader of Shincheonji, another South Korean leader. It's interesting that they all have these different dates on when they believe the second coming has happened, or when there has been somebody on earth who is a direct link to God. And what's interesting in the similarity between the different doctrines and belief systems is that you can kind of trace back to Some Young Moon says that it can only be somebody of this origin between these dates in this time in history with this background. And so actually it turns out that the only person it could be is him. And I feel like Lee Man-hee's very similar. And again, with what you've just said about this movement, it feels like they're all kind of falling.
It's exactly the same. And when I researched those, your episodes, thank you so much for this podcast, because when it helped me coming out of my experience, because when I went back and I listened to the Unification episodes, I was shocked, and I was shocked at the similarities. And like you said, these Korean men are, creating these apocalyptic groups and, stating these dates and these times, and they're just all very, very similar. It was instrumental in me coming out to see, because when you're in it, you feel like it's so special to you. You feel like you're special, like I read the verse that Christ is coming from the East. And so this is Christ that's coming from the East. But then when you hear that Shincheonji is also using that same exact verse coming from the East, then it really stops you. And it's very surprising.
It's that information control that you spoke about before, though, isn't it? How you go to these first classes and you're hit with these revelations that actually church on Sundays is wrong, and anybody doing that is incorrect and won't be saved, because they are practicing the jumbled up version of the jumbled up version that Satan had a hand in, misdirecting God's followers and God's sheep, or whichever way people phrase it. And somehow this group has regained this lost knowledge. I'm sure they have a very, very good way of explaining how they have retrieved this information, that to anybody who may have questions can be explained away in such a way that it kind of squashes any cognitive dissonance that you have going on at that time. Sort of like, oh, okay, but how come if it's been lost, you have the information and then there's an answer given to you, and then you're like, oh yeah, okay then. And so you kind of the less rational side of your brain dominates at that point, because you're not having to do as much work. And when you're having all these new ideas and things thrown at you, the more rational side of your brain that's having to work extra hard during those moments is probably kind of just shutting off each time you're given one of these answers that is used either through justification through spiritual text, or interpretations of certain lines within the Bible. As you said, it's an entirely Bible-based movement, so everything that is explored or practiced in the group is explained through the use of the Bible.
The way that this group gets away with it is they say that God came in the flesh. So Ansang Hong is God. That's how they know it's the truth. And so when he came in the flesh after 1948, after he was baptized, he wrote a bunch of books. So I should mention that it is a Bible-based group, but he also has a lot of books that you purchase from their bookstore. And so those books are as close to the Bible as you can get. And there's several books, and there's several editions, and there's several rewrites. But he came to the earth to write those books. Those are the books of truth. And so that's how so anytime you question something, you just say, well, he was God. He knows he came to the earth in the flesh, and he gave it to us in the book of truth. And so any question you have, it doesn't matter. They just say, well, because God said so, pretty much. It's just like that. I mean, more complicated, but
yeah. I mean, I remember being in religious studies when I was in school, and every child that just didn't want to be in that class would just be like, how do we know God exists? But how do we know? But we don't know, do we? What proof is there? Which I just think is so telling of innocent children and the way that they question things and perceive things. And a lot of the time I know that in high demand religious groups, if children ask those types of questions, they are severely reprimanded. So I don't know if anything would have happened if somebody was to say, how come the world isn't aware that God came back to us in the flesh in 1918? Because that's a pretty significant event.
Right. Well, they would always just say like Jesus, like they would always go back to the time of Jesus. Like how when Jesus came to the earth, only God's people could find him. And he spoke in parables so that, he could find God. You know how it says God's people hear my voice. So he would find God's people. And so, but the people who were not God's people, they would see him as a human, and that's why they would crucify him, and that's why they would mock him and shame him and say like, oh, look, he had brothers and sisters, because everybody would say, well, Ansang Hong had kids, so that's kind of weird, if he was God, why did he have kids? And that was something. And also, God the Mother also has children, and so that's something that a lot of the members are like, okay, that's strange. But they always say it's like Jesus. Well, Jesus had brothers and sisters, and there's a verse in the Bible, that talks about how God was weird that Jesus had brothers. So they're like, well, it's the same now, even though they have children, it's a natural thing, it's a natural part of being human. So why wouldn't they have children? There's a lot of, things like that.
Well, it's just fascinating for me to sit here and listen to you kind of explain that, well, people would say this, and then the example from the Bible would be, but this happened, and then people would say this, but then the example from the Bible would be this. So it's very clear that the text was used to prove, justify, explain away in a very clever way any doubts or questions that people may have had during these classes and sessions. I feel like it's from the way you're explaining it, much more severe in that sense than a lot of the other conversations that we've had on the show, especially because if you're not looking at it from the apocalyptic doomsday side of things, it's not that fear that is being held over followers or congregants. It's actually the text itself, which I think is quite interesting. But you mentioned that you joined the church, you were baptized quickly, you moved up quickly, and then you actually became a deaconess within the church. So what did that step up look like? What other leadership roles are there within the church? What was the actual timeline? How did your responsibilities increase, and all of that stuff that comes with the kind of headline, I became deaconess?
It's sort of like a natural process. as you do the Bible studies and you get like more realizations, quote unquote, and you get more Holy Spirit and moved by the Holy Spirit, you start, spending more time and giving all your money, all your time, all your energy, everything that you have to the church. And so then the church sort of sees your devotion and sees your service. And then you would get recommended to the General Assembly, which is in Korea. So all over the world, they would get recommendations, for who could be appointed. And then it would be approved or not approved. And so I think it was 2011 is when I became a deaconess. And there was a trip to Korea. And at that point, I was a regular preacher. I was preaching. I was a Bible teacher. I had gone through all the seminars, taking care of the children, helping in the kitchen, anything that you can do, and the word deaconess, I think it means servant, somebody who serves. So it's like, when you're baptized, you're seen as a baby. And as you move up, you become more mature. So you're seen as like a mature member, somebody who is a good example, somebody who's obedient, somebody who will pretty much somebody who has passed all the random tests that have been thrown at them that can be, show their loyalty. And so then in 2011, there was a trip to Korea. And then when they came back from Korea, that's when they told me that I had been appointed a deaconess. So it's not really something that you ask to be appointed for. It is something that you kind of want, you're kind of like, oh, that would be nice because, you get a higher, you do get like a higher position in the church, and like people give you a certain level of respect, when you have a title in the church, because it's seen that you are appointed by God, because God is on the earth. So if God appointed you, you just feel like you're Peter, you feel like you're Apostle Paul, and you just feel like you have all this power, and not power in a bad way, but power in like spiritual power. You feel like you have spiritual power, like a spiritual army, and you're ready to go and defeat evil spirits, and it's a good feeling. But it's not really something that you ask for. It's just something that's given to you. And then from there, from a deaconess, you can become a missionary, and then there's a pastor and an elder, and yeah.
I suppose if somebody comes to you and tells you that you've been elected for this position, it's validating your faith, but it's also allowing you to know that your commitments to the church have been recognized, that all of this time that you are giving out of your everyday life is being recognized by leadership within the church. So that certainly does sound like something that you would want to strive for, that you would have that recognized. But I'm not sure if it would be pitched that way, because that might be feeding into somebody's individual ego, which is not something that I know is encouraged.
Right. You're supposed to be humble. You're supposed to be humble and obedient. So to want to have that certain power is not really encouraged. However, you do. Everybody does. So even within the church, there's a lot of like competition among the members, and it's interesting because there's an us versus them mentality outside of, with believers versus unbelievers, but even within the church, there's competition among, who can be the best group leader, who can bear the most fruit, who can recruit the most members, who can preach the hardest, who can preach the most passionate. So there's constantly this competition within the group. And that can be very unhealthy also.
Do you think that competitiveness is encouraged by leadership? Maybe not explicitly encouraged, but there in the relationships that are formed.
I do, because everything is very public. Like everything is publicly posted. When somebody has been when somebody has been appointed, and then you also know when somebody has been demoted. Like it's all very public. And so now I realize it's a way of like rewarding and shaming, and it's a way of control. I realize that now. But when you're in it, you're constantly looking like, is my name on the board? Am I going to be given this blessing? Am I going to be allowed to cook this week? Am I going to be allowed to clean this certain area of the church? Was that blessing given to me, or was it given to somebody else, or was it taken away this week, or something like that? So you're constantly on edge. Like, has this blessing been given to me or taken away from me? And what can I do to fix that situation? And everybody knows, like, if my blessing was taken away, everybody knows. And so you do feel a lot of shame within the church.
I've just finished a memoir that came out this week by an author called Dan Conger, and it's called A Walk Through the Wilderness. And he talks about a fundamentalist Christian sect that he became involved in, a very isolated, very high demand religious group. And if there was one hair on the toilet basin after, God had instructed this person to clean this toilet, then the verbal berating that happened afterwards, and how that person must not take their faith seriously, how they must not appreciate God and God's work if they would leave the toilet in that state. It really it made me, and I know that this was probably Dan's intention, but it made me feel really uncomfortable to read that those chores, I would call them, are being relabeled in a way that makes them seem appealing, and they are not being carried out by people in positions of power or leadership. And that in itself is very manipulative, not only on an individual level, but on a spiritual level. I'm sure we'll talk a bit about spiritual abuse as we go on. But even there, you're saying, you've been given this title of deaconess, and that comes with the responsibilities of cooking and cleaning and all of the things that you probably are already having to undertake in your own home, especially with young children.
Right. But it actually came to the point when we lived in the church. Me and my family lived inside the church. So it was just all naturally, the chores were part of living, like it was all the same. But yes, exactly. And so every Friday they call preparation day, and that's to prepare for the Sabbath day. So all the members come, and, even the leaders, all of them go and they clean and they prepare the whole church so that everybody can keep the Sabbath day holy, but it's every week, and it's that constant busy work, but it's tied to your salvation. So like you mentioned, like cleaning the toilets has to be done precisely. Everything has to be perfectly ready because it's for God. It's to worship God, it's a very high standard.
And that reminds me of when I spoke to Nicola Ranson on my show about her memoir, A Slice of Orange, when she followed Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and they would talk about the very meticulous and methodical cleaning that the ashram would undertake whenever a Bhagwan was going to be around to host a session face-to-face where he would speak to people. And they had head sniffers that would sniff people's hair to make sure that they weren't wearing anything that was scented in such a way. And there was a particular kind of soap that had to be used, which was made and sold on the premises, of course, in the same way that the books you are encouraged to read are printed and sold under the church's name. So it's always interesting for me to draw the parallels between different groups when we get the opportunity. But at this point, you've said that you were expected to go on Fridays to clean the church, to make sure that the top to bottom, inside out, deep clean took place to prepare for the Sabbath. And I do understand that in some ways. If you're going to have guests around your house for a dinner or a barbecue or whatever it may be, then that a lot of the time people will do one of these very deep cleans in their homes to be presentable and to make everybody feel as comfortable as possible. But in your podcast, Playing in Traffic, you said, even the kids would be there and the kids would be expected to join in with the deep clean. And as you said, it's another way to keep your mind on the church and to keep your mind on your faith and to give more time to the church. And it's almost like you're not being given time to breathe or time with your own thoughts outside of the movement. So what did your other commitments look like? You've got Friday, you've got the Sabbath on Saturday. Do you observe the Sabbath in the church the whole day?
Yes. So there are 3 services on the Sabbath day, 9 a.m., 3 p.m., 8 p.m. And so you're expected to just stay the whole day. And so in between services, you would have lunch. So you get groups of people that take turns cooking, and everybody gets their money together and you cook. Sometimes you're cooking for 600 people.
Oh my goodness.
And so it gets expensive. It's your own money. And you're tithing and you're giving your offerings for every service. So 3 times a day on Sabbath day. And you tithe and offering is different. So tithe is 10% of your income, which is in the Bible. And then offering is whatever else you would like to give. But anytime that you come before God, you need to have your offering. So children, everybody gives an offering during service 3 times on Sabbath day. And then they have 7 feasts that happen throughout the year. There's 7 feasts 3 times a year. It's like Day of Atonement, Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, things like that. And during that time, you also have to give a special offering to God, which is monetary offering. It's a business, it's a business model. And so that's how it's ran.
What on earth did you just say about Sabbath day?
Yeah.
That is wild.
So Sabbath day. And then so you'll take turns cooking, lunch, and then dinner. So you don't have to go anywhere. And the kids are taken care of. So the kids have, they're split up into groups of ages, and also they're split up into brothers and sisters. So, the little boys stay with the boys, little girls stay with the girls. And then they have their own little Bible group. Sometimes you can, like, as a leader, because I'm teaching Bible studies all day, like individual Bible studies, and I'm cooking and I'm cleaning and I'm taking care of my members. So I wouldn't see my kid, my son, the whole Sabbath day. That's one of the hardest things. But anyway, so you're busy all day Sabbath day, and then all the other days. And then you also have service on Tuesday. Tuesday night is the service night. But all the other days would be preaching days. So there's preaching meetings 3 times a day. You have preaching in the morning, preaching in the afternoon, and then preaching in the evening. But if anybody wants to come for a Bible study, it's all like open and individual, because everybody gets a different Bible study depending on what they can learn at that moment. So, you make individual appointments. So I might have an appointment, so I can't go preaching, but it's still considered gospel work. So, it's still okay. But so you'll do Bible studies or preaching. And then, you'll also have lunch and dinner together during those days too. Lunch and dinner is also done during that time for preaching members.
So is deaconess a paid position within the church?
No.
How on earth do you
not.
afford to do all these church-related activities if you also have to maintain a full-time job? I mean, even if it's just,
right.
You or your partner that goes out working while the other one stays home with with your young son, but then even if both of you go out to work, you've got childcare to
right.
add to the equation.
So preaching during the day was mostly stay-at-home moms, or a lot of the people who established the churches were Korean. And to be honest, I don't know how they had their money. Some of them had day jobs. You're encouraged to work because you do have to tithe your 10%, but you can't really have like a good job. Like most of the jobs are like temp jobs, or just really basic minimum wage jobs, because you need a lot of time off, like to keep the feast and to keep the Sabbath day and stuff like that. All of that always comes first before your job. But like for me, in my situation, my husband would work full time, and then I was staying home with my son. And so I would just bring my son with me to church, and we would just go preaching all day, and so we would just have preaching meeting in the morning. And then when we became house church leaders, so So later on, my husband became a deacon, and then I was a deaconess. So we were house church leaders in two different churches. So we have a main church, and then those main churches go short-term preaching to little cities outside, and then you establish a little church there. And so we were the church leaders to two different house churches nearby Denver. And during one of those times, we were getting paid $1,000 a month. That's how much we were getting paid. We would tithe 10% of that. So we would give $100. So then, we would have $900. And so we have to feed all the church members. We have to pay all the bills and, take care of everything like that. So that's for food and for everything for the whole month is what we would be paid. But that was only for one of the house churches. The other house church, my husband worked. And so when you're a house church leader, all of your money goes to taking care of the church, taking care of the members, maintaining the church, all the food. The food is a big expense for the members.
Mondays, this is kind of like, let's just say this is like a typical stay-at-home mom's schedule. So Mondays, you're preaching 3 times a day. Tuesdays, you're preaching 3 times a day. And then in the evenings, you've got church commitments. Wednesdays, 3 times a day preaching. Thursdays, 3 times a day preaching. Fridays, you're at the church cleaning, deep cleaning.
Right.
Saturday, you're at the church all day for Sabbath day. And you may have sometime in the week had to have find time to actually prepare meals in advance or go out and buy the ingredients to make sure that everything was prepared.
You would do that on Friday. That's when everybody would go shopping, and you get everybody together and go to Costco, and everybody gathers their money together. And then you have to ask people for money that are in your group. But they don't have good jobs. They don't have a lot of money. So you feel bad, but you have to feed the members.
So there's preaching, there's cooking, there's shopping, there's money collections. There's all of these things that happen. There's also Bible studies that happen in there somewhere as well. So what happens on Sundays? Do you just kind of...
Sundays is preaching also. Sundays would be also preaching. Gosh. Sundays would be more like probably door-to-door preaching because people are home on Sundays, which in Denver, they don't like that because the Broncos are playing. So we would get yelled at a lot, our Denver Broncos. I can give you so they also have prayer times. So if you're a really committed member and you really have a lot of faith, then you need to wake up early in the morning like Jesus did and pray at 5 a.m. So you wake up at 5 a.m. and pray. And then, so this was like when we were living in the church. You wake up at 5 a.m. and pray. Around 7, you meet in the kitchen to make breakfast. And then 9 a.m. is your preaching meeting. So you go to the church and you have a little meeting and everybody gets together and you sing together, you pray so that you can all have a united mind and that you can bear fruit so that it can be a fruitful preaching time and that you can find your brothers and sisters. So you have that little preaching time and then you all go together out preaching. Then you come back and you gather again together in the kitchen. You would cook lunch together, clean together really quick. And then you would have a preaching meeting again at 2:30 where you would sing and do all that again. And then you would go out preaching again. And that might be door to door. That might be campus preaching or and then in the evening time, you would have another preaching meeting around 7 after dinner. You come after work. You come right after work, and then you have dinner together really quick. And then you would have another preaching meeting. And then that's when you would go to like Walmart, Target, King Soopers. You would go to a store because that's where most people gather at night. And then you come home and you clean the church so that it can be prepared for tomorrow. And then you get up and you do it all over again. It's very exhausting. We were very, very, very tired.
Out of a 7-day stint at your time as a deaconess, do you have sort of a rough number, or is this something you can think about whilst we have a quick break? Is there a rough number of sort of average hours a week that you think you had given to the church during your deaconess period?
Oh, I would say, I don't know how many hours are in a week. Do you know? Just I would say I was at church from 9 a.m. until 11 p.m. or midnight every day. And then eventually, like I said, we lived in the church. So then it was just like, that was just my house. That was just my life. So what they do is they have living quarters off to the side, In the big church, they'll have like a living space that they will build. They'll build a little living space. It's all communal living, but in like a house church, so then you would just have like a bedroom where you would live, but then you have to like hide away all your personal things because your bedroom may later become a study room, where somebody has to come or somebody has to be baptized in. So it's very minimalist living. You don't really have a lot of possessions. You don't really have a lot of clothes. You just, all your time, everything, all your money, everything is for the church.
So from 9 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. So we're talking 14-hour days.
I would say in general. Yeah. And so every once in a while they would throw in a seminar. So seminars were to become a Bible teacher. And so those would be maybe 2 or 3 days long, and everybody would come and stay in the church. And it would be morning till night, just studying, so that you could become a teacher, so that you could teach the Bible studies.
So there's 168 hours in a week.
Okay.
If you are contributing around 98 hours a week, let's say, that's 14 hours a day for 7 days. That leaves you 70 hours in those 7 days. So you've got to get sleep. You've got to look after a little one. You've got to go out and run errands that or make sure that there's clean clothes, the dishes are washed, because these are all things that come with having children. I used to not be the tidiest person in the world, but now that's not even an option with 2 little kids. Everything of mine has to be taken care of so that I have the capacity to work out what the kids need and make sure that that's all taken care of. But to have all of this stuff, you must have just been like a zombie, like unable to think about anything else or function on anything other than church.
You can't think straight. I remember being in there and just, you constantly have to set goals, and your mind is always, like you said, church. So like, you really can't think straight. And so that's why, in coming out, sleeping was just so, it was my medicine, just sleeping and just recovering my critical thinking,
Well, it sounds like you had plenty of sleep to catch up on. You were in this group for 14 years, and I can only imagine that as your time within the group lengthened, your commitments and your responsibilities deepened. So I kind of feel like we're like halfway through, and I'm already feeling like exhausted just kind of having the conversation. Do you remember on average how much money you would give to the church, including kind of your tithe and your offerings 3 times a day on a Saturday, and your kids' offerings as well? Oh my goodness. Do you have kind of like a rough idea during any period of your time within the church what an average contribution to the church would look like? Maybe when it's your turn to go out and buy all the stuff for Sabbath, not everybody pays you, so that's coming out of your pocket.
So there's actually a YouTube video. One of my friends that I met one of the survivors, she put she broke it down, all of the money that she had given, and it was a lot. I personally have never done that. So say I was babysitting at the time, and say I would get $100. So $10 would go to my tithing envelope, and then my little boy, I would have him tithe $5 every week. And then I think he would just put like a little, so they would have envelopes so nobody could really see, and then he would just put like $1 in his, and then I think I would put $5 in mine. But my husband had a full-time job, so we would fully tithe his income, so if he was making, I don't know, say $2,000 every 2 weeks or something. I don't remember because it was so long ago. I don't remember how much, but just say $2,000 every 2 weeks, and that's $200. That's $400 a month that we would be tithing just from his income. $400 a month just for his tithing. But then, like you said, on top of that, if we're giving $5 each in each service, so $5, so that'd be $10 a service. So that'd be $30 every Saturday just in offerings. So that'd be 30, 60. So like another $120. Yeah. So it's like $500-$600 a month, for tithe and offering. It's a lot. It does add up. But then, you're paying for the food. And then if you're doing a special construction project, then you have to pay for that. Or if you're doing a special craft project with the children, then you're doing that. And then they have an orchestra. So you have to purchase your instrument, so it adds up.
Oh my goodness. It's so much to think about. And where does the money go? Are you ever told?
No. And that's the thing is, like, normally in a normal Christian church, when you give your tithe and offerings, they'll do like a breakdown. I've seen in other Christian churches where they have like a bulletin, and they'll do a breakdown of, what the money's being spent on. Well, this church does a lot of construction projects, a lot of construction projects, and that's expensive. And they do a lot of like preaching missions, and you have to pay for gas. They have buses, and so there are a lot of expenses, but I know that a lot of members pay for a lot of those things out of their pockets. So it makes you wonder, if you're gathering all this money in tithe and offerings, then why are members also paying out of their pocket, for the food, or for, cleaning supplies, or, the day-to-day things? It's a lot of money.
I imagine as well that given the community that the church creates, if you were to have a sudden death in your family, or lose a loved one, or come into some money or some type of inheritance, or to get promoted at work, the church would probably be very privy to that information, and so of course would know that your income or your assets or financial position in life had increased, and so would be expecting your tithe or your offerings to increase in the same way.
Absolutely. So if you received any kind of like big special monetary gift or something, you would be expected to tithe it. So like around Christmas time, if somebody gave you, your grandma gave you $100, and you need to tithe that, whatever it was. People would tithe their food stamp money. Like if they got money for their food stamps, they would tithe that. The way that it's presented in the church is like, it's not seen as money, it's seen as material. It's called material, holy material, to be offered to God. So you're not even really seeing it as money. In your point of view, you're seeing it as a way to receive blessings. You're seeing it as a way to serve God. So you're really just giving so freely. You're not really worried too much about it, because you feel like in heaven you're going to be paid back in so many blessings.
So you mentioned that a lot of the money that you were giving wasn't necessarily tracked in a way that was made public to the people that were offering tithe and offering offerings. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned that there were always a lot of construction projects and a lot of missionary work that was taking place. So the construction projects, does that mean sort of building more church buildings, or what does, or as you said, kind of the communal living situations?
Looking at it, I think it was a lot of busy work. They would make just different projects all over the place, just randomly. And they would, transform a room into something, and then a few days later, transform it into something else, So like something would be made into a kid's room, and then they would get it all nice and ready for the kids' room. And then, next week, like maybe a few months later, they would say, oh, this should be a study room now. So everything would get knocked down and then rebuilt again. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of money, to continuously keep doing those things. So the brothers were constantly busy doing different kinds of construction work. And one thing I want to say is the people in these groups are so talented. There were really talented workers in there who, they were engineers, and there were electricians and just people who really knew how to do this really beautiful work, and they were doing it for God, but looking back, it's really sad to see so much energy and so much time spent. I mean, years of people's lives that are spent doing these kinds of projects and thinking that it's for salvation. I don't know.
Again, sort of linking back to Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, when you think about Rancho Rajneesh and the people who were able to build an entire town with irrigation and electricity, it was incredible what those people were able to accomplish.
And when you're in it, you feel like, oh my God, look what we're doing. God is with us. God is moving us. But looking back now, I realize, yeah, people are powerful. When a bunch of people get together with one mind and one group and with, one goal, a lot of things can be accomplished. So I think that is encouraging, when it's put into a good purpose, but in a lot of cases it isn't.
I think even just with the Jonestown that was built over in Guyana, again, that's another example of a civilization of people that just banded together in the belief that they were building a better life for themselves and for the other people that would join them. And it really is incredible what people can accomplish, like you said, when they have one goal in mind. And you said that it was the brothers that carried out the construction. So there was no subcontractors or companies that were called out to carry out this construction work. So it was actually followers and congregants that were carrying out the work, right. Notably men. So here we kind of have that misogyny coming in of the deaconess carrying out the cooking and the cleaning, and the deacon carrying out the kind of manual labor construction work, and jobs that might seem more appropriate for men if you're looking at it in that kind of sexist, stereotypical way that people.
Totally. I would say yes. But then there would also be, the brothers would also cook. Like the brothers would have teams where they would cook but yes, it is very, those stereotypes are in there.
So with the role of deacon and deaconess, do you feel like there were any notable differences in terms of your responsibilities or your
expectations, I would say?
Yeah. So if you were preaching and your husband was preaching side by side, would there be any notable differences that you could draw from, and you'd be able to look and say that is a man preaching and that is a woman preaching?
No, I wouldn't say so. I would say some of the most powerful preachers are actually the women. And I would say because, right, it's so focused on God the Mother that, there is a lot of like appreciation for females, a lot of appreciation for, a motherly figure. So I would say that the men and the women, as far as like preaching, as far as the gospel work, it was all pretty equal, but only the men could baptize. Only the men had baptism authority. Okay. But I don't think that the women really felt bad about that. Like, I don't know any woman that was ever like, I wish I could baptize, nobody, it was just sort of the natural way that it is. And I've never seen a female pastor. I've only seen, male pastors, but other than that, it does seem pretty equal as far as the men and the women. They do have a teaching, and Lindsay was like, you better make sure you say this because this is something strange. And as a member, I really never felt like it was strange, but when you keep service, the men and the women are separated. So the men sit on one side, the women sit on another side, and then the children are separated. And the women wear veils to cover their head. Only whenever they would worship or pray. And so from the outside, that is something that is very different. But when you're inside, it's something that you just sort of get used to. It's like there's a verse in the Bible that talks about how women should have their head covered. That's why we have long hair, how hair is like our natural long covering. And so that's something that they do.
You spoke about how you would continue to move up within the church's hierarchy. So at one point, you and your husband, you move into the church premises, you live there communally, and your son at this point. How does your husband feel about the church? Is he fully committed in the same way you are? Because you mentioned that he was kind of on the fence about things and was with you to support you at first. Did things change for your husband?
So over those years, it's a lot of years. So it's sort of a lot of up and down for both of us. But I would say that I was always sort of on an upward trajectory, and he was always sort of, up and down. And so, his quote unquote faith would be good for a while, and then it would go down. But then there was a point where he attended one of the seminars, and it was very intense. And he just loved it and excelled at it. And so then that's when we moved into the church after that. And so his faith was really strong. My faith was really strong. And so then from there, they really trained us to be house church leaders. And so from that moment on, our faith was the same. But then coming out, he kind of came out first, and then I followed him out a little bit later.
And during this time, when you move into the church and your life, which already centers around your faith entirely at this point, once you've moved in and you've pretty much then cut off ties from anything that isn't the church, did that affect your relationship with your family in any way? I know this is something that you explore on your podcast, Playing in Traffic, and I know that it's Lindsay kind of chimes in with what she remembers at certain points, which I am looking forward to speaking to her about her experiences tomorrow. And her episode will air a week after this one. So is there anything you remember about difficulties with your family at any point, or was it kind of just like a natural separation from family and church?
Over time, the strain within the family just naturally happened because we were no longer going to Christmas. We were no longer going to Easter. We were no longer, we wouldn't go. We didn't want to have anything to do with any of those things. But I always, had a strong connection with my family. So we still stayed in touch, but it was still very, it was still fractured, but we always, tried to stay in contact. But then by living in the church, then it was almost impossible to have any time with them at all, especially when we were the house church leaders. I mean, that was almost impossible. But my mom and my sister would come and they would visit me and try to have lunch with me. And I would get irritated because I'm so busy. I have all these members to take care of, and I feel so sorry about that now. But yes, it definitely over those years, it just sort of naturally, caused problems. And so coming out, that's something that I think survivors have a lot of hard time dealing with because we're trying to mend these relationships that had been broken over those times.
Did your family ever voice their opinions to you about your integration into the church? Did they ever tell you that they thought it was quite severe? Did they point out any red flags?
Beginning, yes. In the beginning, they were like, this is crazy. This is a cult. What are you talking about? Some of them would come to the church and do a Bible study and give it a chance. And then they still thought it was crazy. So in the beginning, yes, we had a lot of fights. Over time, they realized that I was in it, and I was being stubborn and there was nothing that could be said. And as we explore on our podcast, Lindsay just kept connected to me, even no matter what happened, even though it was hard and difficult, she just stayed connected to me. And that was really something that helped when I came out. But I know it's not easy on family members. I know it's not easy.
It's always the same sort of advice, though. I often mention for anybody listening that hasn't listened to my episode with Janja Lalich, where she comes on the show and she told me in response to the question of what advice would you give to family members is just to always keep a line of communication open no matter what. It's interesting that Bob Menner said the same thing about when his daughter left to go and join the Runther School of Enlightenment. He never stopped communicating with her. Even when she completely cut him off, he would send her postcards and birthday cards, just so she always knew that option was there. Even if it took years for her to come back. And so Lindsay inconveniently dropping in on you with your mum to be like, hey, let's have lunch. And you're like, I can't do lunch. I have too many things to do. Or, okay, have you finished your lunch now? Because I've got stuff I've got to get on with.
Yes.
It's the same
they
sort of
were very
approach.
persistent. And that stays with you, as you know, even though you may feel annoyed as the cult member, you kind of feel annoyed, but it is so helpful. It is so helpful to always, know that they are there no matter what. But let me say, there are so many cult members, the family members, they get sick of it. They get sick of fighting and they cut them off. And that's why a lot of cult members, I believe, they can't leave because they don't have any support, because after, 20 years, 25 years, there's nobody really left, there's no community. The only community is in there. So it's so hard to leave.
Interesting that your family would openly tell you that they thought it was a cult. And even now, you found it difficult when first talking about this group to apply that word, for probably a number of reasons. I don't particularly feel comfortable using that word. I think it's very, very rare that I myself would apply that word to certain groups. I think if somebody was to go through every single episode and find every time I had said, I think this group is a cult, they'd have less than like $10. Like if they had a pound, like if they had $1 for every time I said it, they'd have less than $10. I think it's one of those strange things where it's been so the subject, the topic, the word, it's been so sensationalized through true crime documentaries and media that the word cult, I think, means something different to perhaps mainstream or commercial individuals that digest the media in that way or that type of media than it does for people that have perhaps studied the subject or experienced the subject firsthand. That's often why the term high demand group is used. From what you said, this is absolutely an example of one of those things. But when I spoke to Esther recently about her experience with an esoteric school in Boston, I read her memoir and then I got to speak to her about her experiences. And she sat down with Stephen Hassan and he said, just say the word, just call it a cult. That's what it was. Just call it a cult. So it's interesting that a leading authority in the field would sit down with a survivor of this particular type of coercion and manipulation and say, just call it a cult because that's what it is. And as soon as you start applying that label to it or that word or that description, it almost allows the individual to process other things that happened within that environment that were perhaps not okay, or were not ethical, or were not the individual's fault, that the individual is not responsible for.
That is such a good point, because as soon as I was able to get over that hurdle, I still don't like the word cult. However, it's a word that everybody knows. It's a word, but once I was able to understand that, then I was able to, like you said, then move on to other things and sort of unravel other things that had happened. But when you're inside of the group, there's so much teachings about why we are not a cult. There's literally a Bible study about why this is not a cult. And so when people do call you a cult and you're in it, you feel so offended because, like my sister would always say, oh, look at Jonestown, look what happened there, and I would be so offended. Like, are you accusing me? Are you comparing me to those quote unquote crazy people? Of course they're not. I know, but when you're inside of it, it just feels so offensive And so I think when you're coming out of it, it's just so complicated. It's so complicated. You know, language is complicated. When you're in the church, I was thinking about this yesterday, the language is so complicated. Your language is limited. You know, you have your words that you use in the church only. And so coming out, it's almost like you have to, you have to regather your vocabulary, and you can't even really express with words what has happened to you, because for all these years, over 10 years, I'm only speaking in this way. I'm only speaking in Bible words. I'm only speaking about prophecy and all of this. And so now coming out, it's like I have to learn how to speak like normal people, and that gives us a lot of anxiety, and it's very, very strange. I'm in love with hip hop. I just really love hip hop and rap. And I think it's because it's such an expression of complicated words put together. And I just love words so much, because it helps me to express myself in a broader way than what I was able to when I was in that group.
And now you have a platform where you speak openly in all manner of ways. So it's kind of like a full circle thing. And I think that's a great way to heal. Anybody that listens regularly will know that I'm an advocate for all things arty. And so I think that's fantastic that you're able to take back your power, to take back your individualism, and to be able to just express yourself however you want to, alongside somebody that wasn't involved directly with the movement, but kind of understands enough about your personal experience that you can kind of bounce things off of one another. And that you're in a safe place where you're not being judged, where somebody's not going to ask questions like, why did you stay? Or why did you move in with them? And even in comparison to Jonestown and Jim Jones as a leader, he moved his congregation over to Guyana. But before that, he moved his congregation over to California, where they lived on a commune, and you moved into the church. And he would keep his followers up all night with his rhetoric and his ramblings. And so people had to go to constant preaching services where he would preach, or he would play himself, over a tape where everybody could hear him. So everybody's time was always filled up with the church-related activities, whether it was construction or whether it was services. So in that sense, it's very similar as well. But of course, there isn't 900 bodies lying around of people that had, believed in this one person, and people who had followed this one person. And that's the big difference. Just because high demand religious groups haven't reached this awful crescendo almost of tragedy, it's almost like they can't be labeled a cult. But actually, if you look at the similarities, if you were to put them in a table next to one another without putting the name of the group at the top, there'd be a lot of things that were exactly the same. And that is what is very scary about these groups. And that is why it's important for people to try and understand the word cult, or the subject cult, or what cults look like, from all manner of perspectives. And that's why we are so lucky to have people like yourself come on the show and offer that education and that information to people, because it would be one thing to talk to a survivor of Jonestown, and I'm sure that there are documentaries that exist that do that, but I don't think the line of questioning would be anything like we have on this show, or like you have on yours, because again of that mass consumption of true crime media. But
that was something that was very important for me to come out. Like you said, when you compare these groups side by side, even without knowing the name of them, they're all at the base level, skeleton level. They are all exactly the same, and all of the tactics are the same, especially the ones that come from Korea. I'm just like so surprised when you line them up side by side, and they are everywhere. I mean, there are high demand groups everywhere. And that's why, like you said, we just want to raise awareness and education, because even though it may not go to that extreme level of Jonestown, I don't know, there's a lot of scary things happening in the world. And like, I know a lot of the survivors that I'm in touch with have been really triggered lately with what's happening with Ukraine and Russia, because one of the things that the church really taught was that World War III would be the end of the world, and that would be, God's punishment. And so all of us are sort of, dealing with a lot of that fear and phobia. And even still, like, there's still a piece of us like, what if they were right? What if this is the Bible coming true? And it's also like coming to terms with, okay, no, we know that they're not right, and understanding that, and understanding that this may be a thought pattern that we have our whole lives that we always have to fight against. But okay, and that doesn't mean that they were true. Like, it's just the indoctrination is so deep within us that anytime we see something on the news, like they would talk a lot about North Korea, firing off missiles and prophecies about North Korea. So anytime we see anything about North Korea, we're like reaching out to each other and just trying to offer support to each other, that just because scary things happen in the world, that doesn't mean that this was the truth.
It's really tough what you've said there. It's a whole mental gymnastics, I think is the term that I've used a couple of times on the show, because it's very it's very full circle, some of the discussions and thoughts that people have when they come on the show and they vocalize what they're feeling, and they kind of can pinpoint the belief system, whether that's kind of what they're taught when they're growing up about hell and hellfire and sinning and the devil's influence and being involved in secular activities, and then leaving the group and then taking part in some of those secular activities, and then finding themselves back in the same mindset that they were in when they were children, learning about hell and hellfire, and how those same trauma responses are triggered by taking part in those activities that you were warned would get you into trouble spiritually, eternally, that would damn your soul. I'm not talking about your experience specifically. This is just kind of one example that I'm pulling out of the air. But even people that have left their movements years later still experience those things. So I've heard some people say that healing is a journey that you will never get to the end of. It's an ongoing process. It changes all of the time. There'll be good times, there'll be bad times. There could be years where you don't have a thought or a trigger or a response, and then something could happen all of a sudden, like this situation going on with Russia and the Ukraine, and at this point the rest of the world, that could just trigger one of those responses and put you right back there again, trying to unravel all of these thoughts and questioning again whether the belief systems that you were so committed to and believed in for over a decade, that your family were involved in terms of your immediate family with your husband and your son, you're right back there kind of questioning whether you did the right thing. And that must be absolutely exhausting to just kind of go through that process over and over and over.
It is, and it's sad to see other people also go through it. But I feel peace in knowing, like you said, that it is going to be a journey that will last my whole life, and that's okay. As long as I'm just still continuously trying to heal and understand what happened.
So once you and your partner moved in to the church premises and you've pretty much kind of given your entire existence as a family at this point to the church, how do things change then? Do you ever go out on missionary work? Do you start to fall back at this time? Do you move up again in the church's hierarchy? What's the next step of your journey?
So then, okay, so we moved into the big main church in Denver for a little while to be trained. And then we were sent to one house church. It was about 2 hours away. And we were there for a little while. And my son was in kindergarten. And, we were the church leaders. And um, it was hard. We went through hardships. But you endure them because you think it's for blessings and to save brothers and sisters. And this was probably 2011 ish. No, I'm sorry, probably around 2012. And then we moved to another house church. And then 2012 they had this big prophecy that was when the end was coming, was 2012.
I remember this. Yeah. 2012 was supposed to be the end of the world. There were songs being released about it. Everybody was kind of joking about it, but sort of like half joking in a way.
We were preparing. We were really preparing spiritually, physically, everything. And so we were in the house church at that time, and we were praying and we were fasting and we were preaching a lot. And we were gathering supplies a little bit, like food and water, to be prepared because something major was going to happen, and then 2012 came, 2012 went, 2013 came and went. And at that time, me and my husband, we were just becoming exhausted being in the house church, for a few years. And just, it was just like, now what, so time went on, and my husband sort of started having a little bit of weaker faith. So I requested us to come back to Denver and just sort of, get a little restart. And when we came back to Denver, my husband just sort of, slowly dwindled out. He was just exhausted and tired. And I stayed in, and I started getting physically sick. My body just started manifesting all these symptoms. I started having digestive problems. I started having migraines. I started getting really sick, and I had to go to the hospital, and I had to get some tests done. And because I had to have these tests done, I couldn't drive. So I had to stay at my mom's house, and I had to sleep on her couch, and it was amazing. And it was at that moment, that was the first time I had been out of the church, for a long time. And so I took a nap, and I just rested my brain for a little while. And then slowly after that, I think that was 2014-ish, little by little, I was still going. I was still going to services, but I wasn't participating in preaching. And then I had my second son in 2015. And so from about 2015 to 2019, me and my two boys, we were still going to service, and we were still tithing and giving our money. But I wasn't participating in preaching. I wasn't participating in the gospel work. So I received a lot of, I realize now it was like shunning, but a lot of, disconnection from the members. All of my quote unquote blessings were taken away. Members really didn't make eye contact with me, wouldn't really talk to me, really didn't want to have anything to do with us. So we would just come to the church for our service, and then we would just leave. We would come home, have lunch, and then we would come for the next service, and then we would leave, and then we would go to the next service 3 times on Saturday, do all that. And then in 2020, Passover came, and that was when coronavirus was happening, and when the shutdown was happening, right when it first started. And I was scared. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know it was a worldwide pandemic, and people were getting sick. It was before the vaccine and everything. And Passover was coming. And to be honest, I was kind of excited to keep the Passover because it's that trauma response, right? Like something scary is happening, so I need God's protection. And so, but then I got the message that me and my family were not allowed to keep the Passover. that year because we were not being faithful members. And I just want you to understand, like, Passover is the only way to be protected, and you have to renew your covenant every year. You have to renew your promise with God every year. And if you don't, you're not going to have God's protection. But there's a second Passover. It's like a month later. So they said, you're not allowed to keep this Passover, but if God allows, and if we're still here, then you and your family can keep the second Passover, which was, going to be later, 30 days later or something. But it was at that time that I was just like, no, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot do this anymore, because I finally realized how much control they had over me, and how much they were holding on to me out of fear. Like, I was only believing because I was scared of the state of the world. The world is scary. There's disasters and global warming, and Donald Trump was our president. Like, there's so many scary things, So they were playing off of that vulnerability. And for the first time, I was finally able to see it, how they were like, well, you can't keep Passover now, but if God allows, you can keep Passover, next month. But it was just, and so at that moment, I mourned and I grieved, and I experienced a lot of panic and a lot of anxiety, and it was really, really, really hard, and then finally I realized that I needed to speak out, and that was part of my healing process. So now I'm here.
I had written on my question list, left in 2020, was it COVID ? Because a few people we've spoken to said that they couldn't go to services, or their commitments were really stripped back because of lockdown restrictions. People had what you experienced at your mum's on the sofa, that chance to really take a step back, get some sleep, really kind of self-care. When you were going through tests at the hospital, were they able to conclude anything, or did they come to you and say your psychological symptoms are manifesting into physical ailments that are actually causing you to become physically unwell?
To be honest, I never told the doctors about the group. I never told the doctors I was in the group. I never told the doctors I was leaving or struggling with any kind of spiritual things or any. So they only knew my physical symptoms that were manifesting. And so I was continuously going to the doctor. And I don't even think it was in my thought process to mention it, because I didn't even realize that it was even part of it. But they couldn't find anything. They couldn't find anything physically wrong with my body. And now I realize that it was because all of the stress and anxiety and the sleep deprivation, it was, and, just the fear and all of that, it just manifested into these symptoms. And as soon as I, came out and started processing and thinking about what had happened, then these symptoms went away, So I thought it was interesting that my body was literally telling me that something was wrong. And so I had to listen. I had to listen to my body.
I remember going to the doctor one time, and I was not sleeping at all. I couldn't keep any food down. I was just, everything I was trying to eat, I was just throwing it straight back up. And I was working like 14 to 16-hour shifts on a private ward with dementia and schizophrenia patients that were kind of over the age of 60. So it was a very difficult environment to be in. And I was there for a very long time. And the commute to work was actually quite long as well. So by the time I was getting home and able to actually wind down and switch off and go to sleep, I was not getting enough sleep, especially because you're on your feet all day. You're taking care of individuals. So that requires a lot of physical strength as well as psychological and emotional strength, because you of the individuals that you're working with and the conditions that they have, both neurologically and physically in themselves. So I was going to the doctor, and my hands were just shaking all the time, and my concentration was off. And I said to the doctor, like, I can't stop being sick. I can't keep food down. And the doctor asked me about my lifestyle, and she asked me, how much sleep I get. And I was thinking, what does this have to do with anything? And she was so stern. And I remember her being what I thought was quite mean or quite harsh, because she just said to me point blank, she was like, so you don't realize that your anxiety and your stress is causing you to be physically sick. And I was so kind of taken back by her question, which was a rhetorical question. I just sort of, what do you mean? What do you mean?
I wish somebody would have said that to me. I wish somebody would have told me that, because I had no idea. And I kept going and kept going and kept going. And I'm like, something is wrong with me.
I suppose if you didn't think to just even mention the group, or if nobody asked you about your personal circumstances in that sense, she was just so to the point with me, which is not something that I'd experienced with healthcare professionals up to that point. You know, it felt like she was kind of attacking me. Of course, it feels like you're being attacked when somebody says to you, you know, I'm giving you a diagnosis of anxiety. And you think, no, I'm not anxious. I don't get anxious. I'm not an anxious person. I don't have a medical condition that requires self-care and self-help and self-improvement. You know, I'm taking care of myself. Obviously, I was not taking care of myself.
Right. And especially in the group, they don't encourage self-care. You know, like if the doctor tells me to do self-care, that's not something I'm gonna do.
Absolutely. So then the doctor's kind of like, here's, you know, do you want medication to manage your condition? And I'm sort of there like, what condition? I don't have a condition. Which is so ridiculous now, kind of looking back on that conversation that I had with this woman about 10 years ago. But that really did change my life. And it's so often that I will sit down and speak with people, and although I may not have had a cult-like experience myself, there are so many small parts of these people's experiences that I'm able to relate to. And the fact that you said that you had to go to hospital because you were manifesting all of these symptoms, it's so similar to people that have spoken to us. You know, just last week I did a small highlight video about eating disorders because it was Eating Disorders Awareness Month, and I have read Ronit Plank's work where she talked about body image and how much that was affected maybe by her mother going to follow Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He's like kind of like the second focus of this episode today. I spoke to Lisa Cohn, who talked about her eating disorder and her anorexia in her book To the Moon and Back, A Childhood Under the Influence. It's like her symptoms manifested in her trying to take back some type of control somewhere. Mary Mahoney was the same in her memoir, Abnormal Normal, where she had an eating disorder because she was trying so hard to maintain control over her body image. When people take away all of your ability to think for yourself, to make decisions, where your dependency level is so high on leadership or the group or permission to do something or tasks that you are responsible within the group that week, whatever it looks like, just being able to take back some of that control may manifest itself in something like an eating disorder on what you do or do not put into your body. That is a decision that you can make that day.
Right. It is interesting. Sometimes, you know, I'll talk with our other survivors and, you know, we just compare like little things that we do now that, you know, that are just kind of strange. And we're like, you know, it's true. So this is something that will affect us, you know, for the rest of our lives and just sort of change who we are.
What actually happened when you decided to leave the group? You had this moment where you realized that the Passover is being used as a manipulative tool against you. Of course, the church isn't going to say you're not allowed to take part in Passover and that's it. There's no way to redeem yourself, because if the church did that, then their followers would probably decrease quite significantly in numbers. So there has to be some type of olive branch. There has to be some type of way for them to kind of hook you back in, like a dangling the carrot kind of scenario. So they do say to you, you know, you can come back in a month if you show us that you're committed, or if God permits it, I should say.
Right. It is interesting because my high school friend who had originally invited me, I hadn't spoken to him in years and years and years because, people, the church leaders are sent all over the country, so you don't really see, even the workers don't really see each other a lot. So he was, sent to other places. And so I hadn't spoken with him in a long time. And then, sure enough, in between the Passover when I wasn't allowed to go and then the second Passover, he called me and had this long conversation, and he was trying to get me to come back, but we didn't go for the second Passover. But it is interesting that you mentioned, that they may try to reach out. And then honestly, after that, they tried to reach out a few more times, but after that I haven't heard from them again.
That is so interesting. That, of course, I wonder who it was that asked him to call you.
Right.
And what that
Right.
conversation
I hadn't
sounded
spoken
like.
to him in years and years, and honestly, it hurt my feelings a little bit because, that was somebody that I had a connection with before we even joined this group. So it is somebody that I expect to still continuously have a relationship with, but we hadn't spoken all those years.
Oh, that's so...
And it was really nice to hear from him. It was really nice to hear from him. But the only reason that he called was because he wants me to come for the Passover. And that has been one of the hardest things, is losing that community of people, because those are people that when you're communally living with people, you're cooking together and you're sleeping, so closely together, and you're sharing the same bathroom. I mean, everything is so intimate within that group. But as soon as you leave their reality, then it's like you're totally cut off and you just miss them so much. And I know that by me having the podcast and by me speaking out more, I know that it's hurting them, and it's that they're viewing it as, I'm being tempted by Satan and I'm doing Satan's work. And so that hurts me because I don't want them to feel like that, because I have a genuine love and respect for them as people, and I really miss a lot of them, and I miss those connections with them. So that has been a struggle for me.
It's very hard when people talk about their experiences leaving a group, and this is a lot of the mourning and grief that you spoke about comes with losing that community. But that community is conditional, and that is not love. Mm-hmm. That is not a pure connection or a pure friendship or a pure relationship if it's conditional. You can be a part of this environment and this community, and we will love you and we will share these intimate experiences with you on the condition that you follow this belief system without question. You commit all of this time and money to this religion without question. You suffer the psychological and physical effects of this high demand religious group without question. And that is not, it must be so hard to have to balance those two things in your mind, to remember that the community you had was such an important part of your life and has had such an influence on you as an individual, but also is not necessarily good for you as well.
Good.
And the really difficult thing about the individuals involved in that community that you had such strong connection with, their thoughts towards you and their actions towards you and the shunning process and all of the things that come with the labeling of somebody that leaves a group like this, is that the same spiritual abuse will be happening to those individuals that you had that connection with. They will be told to think about you in a certain way, to talk about you in a certain way, using that biblical text to justify you being played by Satan, you being tempted by worldly people and being involved in secular activities. And it's so hard to think about those people that you loved, that you had that connection with, that you shared all of that time of your life with, that helped you raise your child, because at times you couldn't be with your child.
That's one of the most complicating things, is some of the people I miss the most are like the highest in the positions, like my pastor and his wife. they, like you said, they helped me raise my son. And I just have so many fond memories with them. But at the same time, I also know that, they were the cause of a lot of my spiritual trauma. So it's so complicated. It's like, it's very complicated. It reminds me of, the kidnapper who falls in love with the person that
Stockholm
kidnapped
syndrome.
them.
Yeah, I think that term is applied a lot of the time to these types of groups as well. I think that, again, it's probably a lifetime of trying to unravel things. And it must be very hard to lose those connections and know that those people feel that way about you, but not because that's what they independently think and feel, but that's what they're being taught to think and feel. And because of the thought reform that's taken place, there's no capacity for them to nurture their own thoughts and feelings around whether that is actually what they agree with. And that concept in itself is extremely difficult. It's like if you have a friend who's involved in a relationship that has abuse involved, you have a friend who is being domestically abused by their partner. If you try to get involved, your friend lashes out on you and tells you not to get involved because it's none of your business, or you don't understand, or they leave the partner, but then they return to the partner, and it's only when they really decide that themselves that they're ready to leave that they make that decision. So even, in those situations, you see a lot of the hallmarks of cult-like methods of control and manipulation, just on one-on-one situations that include domestic abuse. And
you're helping me so much. Like, I feel like I'm in therapy. You're helping me to see it from so many, from different perspectives that I've never thought of before. Yeah.
After you finally decided to leave and your old high school friend reconnects with you, oh my goodness, yeah, there's another comparison there. I just finished reading Manhattan Cult Story by Spencer Schneider, who I've interviewed on the show before, and he was very close to Sharon Gans, who ran the esoteric school that Esther Friedman went to, who I mentioned earlier on in this episode, only she went to the Boston branch. But Sharon was like, ring Spencer and tell him that he's not allowed to come back, or I don't think it's a good idea for him to come back. And he'd been in this group for like 20 plus years. And the person phones Spencer and says, Sharon told me to tell you that she doesn't think you should come back. And he says, yeah, no, I think I agree. And they're like, no, hang on. She wants you to come back. She wants you to come back. That's not what she meant. So when they say to you, if you come to the second Passover, it's all okay. Well, actually, first of all, they say to you, if God permits it, you'll be allowed to come to the second Passover. And then when it doesn't look like you're going to make any extra efforts to make sure that happens, they've got people phoning you like, no, seriously, you can come to the second Passover. But again, you're kind of just like, no, thanks. So it's funny when survivors call the bluffs of leadership who are really trying to get them back in, and leadership just don't know what to do when you're like, do you know what? Actually, I agree with you. I don't think I should come. And then they're pulling out all different tricks to try and reel you back in. But what?
Right. And it's so funny for me because I used to be that leader and I used to do the same stuff. So it's like, I think that coming out of the group, that's another thing that people have to also process is the guilt that we have for things that we did, because we were also, we were carrying out these mind control tactics without knowing it, but we were still doing it. And we were also manipulating people. So that's another interesting thing.
It's still interesting to hear about you being able to recall times where you have done that yourself in a position of leadership. But what does your life look like after you finally decide to leave? You reconnect with your family. You've talked about this confusing and difficult journey that you've had to go on, where you try to unpack things and unravel things and experiences in your mind. Have you accessed any type of therapy? Have you and your partner sat down and really explored and spoken about things at length? Do you meet with survivors? Because you talk about missing this community, but of course you're now part of a different community where you still offer each other love and support, and perhaps that is more unconditional than the one you were part of
Right.
before.
Exactly. So I have not personally gone through therapy. It's something I would like to explore. I love podcasts, and I love Steve Hassan, and I love Yanya Lalik. So I read a lot of their books and listen to a lot of podcasts that they are on. And I've been utilizing cannabis in my healing journey, and yoga and meditation, things like that. But yeah, you mentioned the survivors. So the podcast has brought together so many amazing survivors that have contacted us and have actually been guests on our podcast, and we have spoken with them, and that's been really fun. But I think that that's been one of the best parts about healing, is connecting with the survivors. And some of the people that I'm close with now in this group, I was also in the group with, there was another deacon I was in the group with in Denver, and we're very close now. And like you said, the relationships are different because we're all allowed to be ourselves. Everybody is doing their own individual things, and everybody is supportive of whatever choices they want to make. And that's why I think it's really beautiful, and it's really fun. And it's a different type of relationship, like, even though I was living together communally with the people, every day, I wasn't even as close to them as I am now with the survivors, who I'm just recently meeting. And that's something that the church really discourages. You're not really allowed to share contact information. Even when you go to visit Korea, you meet all these people from all over the world, and you build these friendships, but you're not allowed to share contact information, just in case one of them falls away and they may lead you astray. So even though you have a community, individually you're not really connected as to each other,
which is possibly another reason why it's discouraged, for that exact reason.
So when you come out, it's really hard to meet people, but I think now we're starting to build a community of people together. So that's been really, really helpful for all of us, I think.
I think that's great. And something that your podcast does really well, that I really admired, that I've kind of tried to adopt a little bit of myself, is where you said, I'd spent so many years not allowed to think for myself, not allowed to talk about myself. So I'm going to talk about myself on this show. You just say openly, like, I am going to talk about me and my experiences, and I'm going to allow myself to be validated in a way that I haven't been able to for years and years. And I'm not going to feel sorry about that. And I think that's so empowering, and I think that's so important. And that's one of the things that I really love about the work that you and Lindsay have been doing. It's that you're not apologizing for exploring your experiences. They happen to you. They're your experiences to talk about. You own them. They belong to you. And the fact that you share those with others is also empowering. It allows us to understand your experiences if we haven't lived them. It allows others to be validated if they have lived them. So I think that it's great for those reasons. It's also great because there are sections where you focus on family. You make a point of really wanting to offer insight and advice for family members who may have lost loved ones to high demand groups. I don't think there's enough out there on that particular subject. So I really love how you bridge that gap. I think that's a great resource and tool for people, because I don't think there's a black and white way to answer that question. And any insight that we can gather from survivors on what would have helped you in your journey, what your family could have done for you, or what they did do for you that worked, I think that's incredibly important work. I think the fact that you went on this journey with your husband and your children, and you're still together, I think that speaks for itself in the strength of your relationships and how you've been able to communicate with your husband since leaving the group. The fact that you and Lindsay talk about your family relationship now, and her kind of peppering her memories on top of your thoughts, is so interesting. When you talk in Playing in Traffic about how you began to reject Christmas, and actually it became triggering for you. Anything that was related to Christmas was like you had to stay away from. So there was one room in your grandma's house that you wouldn't go into because that's where she kept her Christmas decorations. And Lindsay kind of explains that, oh yeah, I remembered, you wouldn't even go into that room because there were Christmas decorations in there and you were terrified. So the fact that you have somebody else that can remember you reacting in that way shows that it's real. It's not just you said, oh, I was terrified. It's actually another person that said, you wouldn't go in that room because I could see that you were terrified. So it kind of, it adds that perspective and that layer as well. So as I said at the start of the episode, if anybody is looking for further insight in this, to know how to support loved ones, to understand the psychology a bit more behind these things, because you do go through Stephen Hassan's bite model in depth as well. So you go through the behavior, information, thought, and emotional control, all the different parts within that bite model that are relevant and active within this movement as we talk right now. You know, through your lived experience, you talk about them. Lindsay offers her insight and perspective where she can, and how she saw the changes in you and all of that. So Playing in Traffic, it's available on all podcast platforms. I will post a link to the show in the episode description as well for anybody that wants to go. But I do recommend it. I think it's fantastic work. I think it's incredibly important. And I am so thankful that you came here to talk to me today about your experiences, that you are so open to helping others, that you understand that this is a difficult experiences that you've been through, but you're not in a rush to kind of figure that out or become fully healed. I think that's a really important and telling for anybody else that's kind of starting their journey towards uncovering thoughts and working through things. So thank you for your insight, for your experience, and for just agreeing to come and sit down and share your story with me today.
I just want to thank you so much for your work, because, you know, you have your podcast, you know, you have such a catalog of so many different stories, and understanding what happened to me the way that I understand what happened to me is by understanding what happened to others. And so by hearing, you know, all those conversations, it's just been so helpful, and it continues to be helpful. And every time I get a notification, you have a new episode out, I'm like, yay. So thank you so much for your work.
That's so exciting for me to hear. Yeah. And it's actually quite overwhelming as well. I'm just really glad that the work that's going into this show is helpful to people, and to hear that it is just means that there's more reasons and motivation to make sure that, you know, keep tracking guests down to come and speak on the show, keep putting work into the podcast so that other people can learn from it, but also hopefully so that individuals can come on the show and tell their stories in a way that's not judged, in a way that's not kind of like, got you. In all of those ways.
That is so crucial, because we have been manipulated, and we, you know, so it's hard for us to be vulnerable. It's hard for us to trust, and that's why I wanted to do my own podcast, because I want to have my own platform to say how I want to say it, you know, but it's very, very helpful for platforms like yours. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been really fun.
Thank you. I'm glad. I know we didn't get to cover everything, but what was really handy about this is
that we could talk for hours.
We could, but usually I don't have a podcast to direct people onto. So you're doing all the hard work for us over there on your show, and I'm so glad that you're able to take back that power for yourself. I think that's so incredibly important however it looks for people going through these journeys, whether it you know, we've spoken about this before, whether it is going to therapy, whether it is talking to family and friends and people you trust, keeping a journal, starting a podcast, writing a blog. We had Dario on here last week who raps, and he did a rap for us, and it was incredible. There's so many amazing things that people are doing to take back their power, and it's so inspiring and empowering, and I just think it's amazing. I think you're all amazing. So thank you so much for your time, Tony. I can't wait to hear more content, and I will speak to you soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you so much. We'll talk later.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Tony and Lindsay even have their own podcast called Playing in Traffic that goes into Tony's experiences and what Lindsay remembers in much more detail. And that is available on all major podcast platforms today. And they have even allowed me to include their disclaimer song within these episodes, even though I mistakenly called it a disclosure song, although you could argue they are one and the same. Here to speak about this movement is Tony. That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.